Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Endless Flight, The Genius and Tragedy of Joseph Roth, by Keiron Pim, narrated by Peter Noble. I have covered many miles, between the place where I was born and the towns and villages I have lived in the last 10 years, and lived in only apparently to leave them again, lies my life, amenable more readily to spatial than to chronological measurement. The years I have put behind me are the roads I have travelled. Nowhere, in no parish register or cadaster, is there a record of my name or date of birth. I have no home, aside from being at home in myself. Joseph Roth, letter to Gustav Kiepenheuer on his 50th birthday, June 1930, translated by Michael Hoffman. Joseph Roth was one of the first to despair in those times. His characters were always in flight, and he predicted everyone would have to flee. His books are no more than pale reflections of what he produced during those conversations in the dark hours of the night. In visionary images, he depicted what we all dreaded, and then fell into self-absorption again. When he looked up, he might casually remark, "It's all nonsense, folks. Don't take my agonies so seriously. I simply don't know how to live." Das Land, das ich verlassen musste, by Max Tau, Bertelsmann, 1961, translated by Eileen Walliser-Schwarzbart. There are only two things that can destroy a healthy man: love trouble, ambition, and financial catastrophe, and that's already 3 things. And there are a lot more. Verwechslung by Peter Altenberg, S. Fisher, 1918, translated by Clive James. A Memory of Joseph Roth. In February 2020, I spoke on the telephone with the 90-year-old Dan Morgenstern, a noted jazz writer and emeritus director of the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. He has lived in the USA since 1947, but was born in Munich and raised in Vienna, the son of Zorma Morgenstern, a novelist and close friend of Joseph Roth. Dan is, to the best of my knowledge, the last surviving person to have known Roth. Here's my own tiny glimpse of Joseph Roth. In October 1938, my mother and I visited my father, Zorma Morgenstern, in Paris. Zorma and Roth were teenagers when they first met, and they were friends until the very end. I remember the hotel where both my father and Roth were staying, the Hôtel de la Poste, not too far from the Jardin du Luxembourg, and I remember Roth very well for a boy of not yet 9. That first encounter at the hotel where we also stayed, in his favourite spot in the lobby, I was scared by his voice, which at that late stage was ravaged by alcohol, yet quite resonant. It was pretty loud and very hoarse, like that. It was a typical French hotel. When you came in, there was the check-in desk on the right. Then there were tables in the lobby. There was the one that we would call in Vienna his Stammtisch, his regular table where he always sat. It was a round table where there was room, in addition to his chair, for 2 or 3 other people to sit. And that was the way it was. People came by the way they do in France for a glass of wine. Roth would sit there from the time he got up in the morning, and he would call for a drink. Garçon. He knew the garçon quite well by then, so when he called out he would come with his drink, because he knew what he was drinking. Some liqueur, it was always the same. He would yell and the guy would come. So I was a little scared, but very quickly I found that he was very nice to me, extra nice to me. And I think there were sentimental reasons for that. I was his close friend's son. We became friends, sort of. When I came down in the morning, he would pat me on the head and feed me centimes to put in the pinball machine, and he would buy me drinks. Not alcohol, usually tomato juice. It was clear to me that my father was very concerned about him. He didn't say anything to me, but it was clear he was looking out for him, making sure that he ate something, making sure he had a bath. My father would be physically supportive of him and see to it that he got to his room all right. Sometimes we'd go for a little walk, my father and I and Roth. He was not walking too well. He had a cane by his side there on the chair, and he used the cane to get up and shuffle across the room. Unfortunately, he was considered to have very little time left. I was not old enough to be a proper judge of that, but I could tell that he was not well. When we left Paris, I remember saying goodbye to him, and even at my age I had the feeling it was not very likely that I would see him again. I think he wished me a good journey. He would have patted me on the head. He was a bit like a friendly bear to me. I can still hear that voice and recall its rhythm when he called for a drink. Introduction. Pictures of the little town. The air grows chill, the mists descend. 'Tis in the evening first, our home we prize. Faust, Part 1, by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. In the plains of western Ukraine, that once lay within the Austrian crown land of Galicia, there is a town called Brody that looks as you would imagine it might if it were built up over centuries as a commercial and cultural centre, then stripped of all that enabled it to flourish and allowed to fade for a century, its decline intermittently accelerated by warfare on its streets. Weathered floral friezes decorate Habsburg-era shop fronts, and paint peels from the solemn-faced corbels that support rusty, iron-railed balconies. Its old marketplace is an empty strip of tarmac, its synagogue a ruin. In the middle of town there is a street called Ulica Zolota, where clusters of dilapidated buildings from its heyday still stand, conspicuously delicate between lumpen concrete flats and shops of the post-war Soviet period. Number 18 is now a confectioner. At the end of the 19th century, along with the since rebuilt number 20, it belonged to a rich tailor who stitched bright uniforms for the soldiers of the Imperial and Royal Army. A narrow alley runs between the two buildings. If you walk through it to the street, you see a former bookshop fronted with bas-relief busts of once eminent men, and to your left, the ghostly old Hotel Bristol, dirty white as the snow that covers the town through the winter. The alley leads back to a patch of land where a house once stood, and in that house, in September 1894, a young woman nursed her newborn child, not knowing whether the husband who had abandoned her would come home. Later, her family told stories, resentful tales about this strange man they had never quite trusted, about how he had vanished when Maria Grubel needed him and left them to support her and the child. Nahum Roth was, they said, on a steam train rattling through the German countryside towards Berlin when his behavior began to disturb the other passengers. The former rabbinical student worked as a grain buyer for a Hamburg export company, but in the past few days his life had collapsed. Someone he trusted had stolen his grain from a store in the Silesian town of Katowice. He had dashed there with Maria to find the goods, but failed. He left her in Silesia and travelled the 500 miles to Hamburg to pacify his employers, but failed. Now, ashamed and facing ruin, he was heading back to Katowice to bring her home to Brody. The experience had shattered him. His grasp on reality had for some time been tenuous, but here, in the train carriage, he seemed deranged. When the train reached the next station, Roth was manhandled to the platform and transferred to a German psychiatric institution, from where he was handed on to relatives in Rzeszów, Galicia, They knew a nearby Hasidic wonder rabbi reputed to have miraculous healing powers, so they sent Roth to him. Maria returned alone to Brody and waited for her husband, but heard nothing. On 2nd September, in all likelihood at her father's house in the courtyard of Ulica Zolota, known then to German-speaking Jews as Goldgasse, she gave birth to a boy, but Nahum Roth did not come to meet him. After some time, Maria's brother, Salomon Grübel, arranged a meeting at the rabbi's premises. On being introduced to Grübel, Roth began to laugh, and for the duration of their encounter, he barely stopped. Grübel noted his handsome, blonde-bearded face, with the same luminous eyes that had come to distinguish his young son. Roth had no comprehension that he was a father. He lived with the rabbi for the rest of his life. Years later, the son would write, "He must have been a strange man, an Austrian scallywag, a drinker and a spendthrift. He died insane when I was 16. His specialty was the melancholy, which I inherited from him. I never saw him, but I remember when I was 4 or 5 I had a dream of a man in whom I saw my father. 10 or 12 years after that, I first saw a photograph of my father. I had seen the face before. He was the man in my dream." This was almost certainly an invention, but we can believe he dreamed of the parent he never met. Willing his lost father into some form of existence, trying to replace the irreplaceable with substitutes both real and imaginary, would preoccupy Joseph Roth for his entire life. A grand Ukrainian city just east of midway between Prague and Kiev has become a shorthand for the mutability of place and identity in Eastern Europe. Prior to 1991, it spent half a century as Lvov, within the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. Before that, it was the Polish city of Lvov for 3 decades. Some Poles today maintain it is only on loan to their neighbours. And for a few months in 1918, it was the capital of the West Ukrainian People's Republic. On a modern map, it's called Lviv, but if you look at one from the early 1900s, you'll find it called Lemberg, lying in Galicia at the eastern edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At that time, its Yiddish-speaking population called it Lemberg. On both maps, if you run your finger 60 miles further east-northeast, you'll find Brody. On the older one, it's by the Galician border with the Russian Empire. On today's, it's well within Ukraine. The phrase Ukraina means borderland, an old border town in a borderland. Regardless of where the lines lie on the maps, Brody has always been somewhere in between, its history one of transience and migration. Lying as it does on the road from Lviv to Kiev, people stream through daily, and some stop for a generation or two. Its population today is around 23,000, not so different from when the 1900 Austro-Hungarian census recorded 16,400 inhabitants. But its demography and fabric are much changed. That year, 72% of the residents were Jewish. At the community's peak in the late 19th century, this figure was above 80%. In March 1881, outraged Russians had wrongly blamed Jews for the murder of the reforming Tsar Alexander II, venting their fury through pogroms in 200 towns around their country, which spurred thousands of people to dash over the border into Brody. The town became known as the Polish Jerusalem, and had an especially high population of Hasidim, people with a murmured prayer for every stage of the day, who were drawn there because in the 17th century it had been home to the Baal Shem Tov, their spiritual leader. The late 19th century side streets grew clustered with yeshivot, small centers of religious study, where black-clad boys wearing skullcaps and sidelocks would debate Talmudic law and spill out onto the pavements chattering in Yiddish, the lingua franca of Jewish Europe. 3 times a day, 3/4 of Brody's population turned to face the real Jerusalem and pray. Like every Galician shtetl, it had its revered, mystical wonder rabbis, or tzaddikim. The wonder rabbi dispensed blessings, worked miracles, and issued sage guidance for every dilemma imaginable, assisted by a coterie of Hasidim who brought his meals and prayed with him, admitted and withheld his visitors. On one occasion, in 1924, the renowned Frankfurter Zeitung journalist and author Joseph Roth, until recently based in Vienna, but presently engaged in a tour filing dispatches from Poland and Ukraine, resolved to visit such a rabbi. He would later describe this phenomenon in a study of the Eastern Jews. This tzaddik was reputed to intercede not merely between man and God, but between man and his fellow man, which is still harder. Roth arrived in time for the Jewish high holidays, when the rabbi would hold court. He rose at 5 o'clock, while the chilly Galician fogs lifted and the horses shivered, and set off in a farm cart with 5 mothers and their small children. The women were poultry traders, clad in black woolen cloths, and all were bound for the rabbi. They reached the town as the sun rose on what became a warm, gleaming autumn morning, and Roth saw that many others had preceded him, some sleeping in barns and passageways while they awaited their audience, others squatting on wooden planks that formed crude pavements by the muddy street. His detached descriptions of the town's squalor and the people's coarseness imply he was entering foreign territory. As the appointed hour neared, the hordes thronged around the rabbi's home. A burly, copper-bearded Hasid served as a gatekeeper, gruffly keeping them at bay. Roth caught his eye. The journalist's fur coat and high riding boots helped set him apart. He asked to speak to the rabbi. The man advised him to write down his problem, and the rabbi would read it and pray for him. Roth insisted, but met more resistance. "Can you come back after the holidays?" Roth pleaded, and was told to go around the house and in through the kitchen, where he found a merchant who had enough money to skip the queue. When Roth's turn came, he entered a simple room to find the rabbi, black-bearded, grey-eyed, bony-handed, with sharp white nails, sitting at a table by a window overlooking a courtyard. The man glanced at Roth as he asked what he wanted, then looked out of the window again. I replied that I had heard much about his wisdom and had wanted to meet him. Roth wrote. "God is wise," the rabbi said, beckoning the reporter to come close, at which he shook Roth's hand and bade him a warm farewell. Roth knew such men's limitations of old. There were no answers here, except to less exacting people's questions. Still, some insistent part of him remained fascinated by their legends. His record of this trip formed part of a perspicacious survey from Paris to Russia, also examining Jewish life in Berlin and Vienna, published in 1927 as The Wandering Jews, Juden auf Wanderschaft. He writes of the Eastern Jews with unflinching clarity, some disdain at their lack of refinement, but more often sympathy and affection, verging on admiration for their refusal to assimilate. If he is wry in evoking the unsophisticated Eastern Jewish world, he is vitriolic about the diluted Judaism he sees in the West, as practiced by the old shtetl dwellers' grandsons, who need a church-style organ to put them in the mood, and whose God is a redaction of nature, their prayer a formula, and on top of that, they're proud of it. His subsequent description of the Eastern Hasidim's exuberant ring dancing on the Feast of the Torah tingles with their energy. But while he personalizes the narrative, intermittently switching into the first person to describe such encounters, he holds something back. Eastern Jews are always described in the third person. When he writes we and us, he means Germans and Austrians. He suggests that he stands within that collective, not the Jewish tribe. Only an informed reader would know that far from diligently investigating an alien world, in visiting Galicia, Joseph Roth was returning home. The unnamed shtetl his book describes is Brody, if it is anywhere. Like much of Roth's non-fiction, some details are likely polished, others transplanted. He deals in facts of the poetic and psychological kind, more than the literalities of journalism. Of the 5 chief elements of reportage, who, what, where, when, and why, he concerns himself with the first, second, and last. But even with the who, the few deft strokes with which he draws his characters rarely include adornments such as names. Extrapolation and analysis take precedence over chronology, location, and narrative. He is forensic on specific human foibles, on glancing moments that summon a psychological landscape, but his broad brush regarding place and time. The text is an amalgam of observation, polemic, and memories, old and new, and those of Brody are a defining ingredient. The little town lies in the middle of a great plain, not bounded by any hill or forest or river, he writes. Well, Brody lies in a plain, but it is enclosed by woodland, and to the west by the Boldurka River. The town's name comes from the Ukrainian for ford. It runs out into the plain. It begins with little huts and ends with them. After a while the huts are replaced by houses. Streets begin. One runs from north to south, the other from east to west. Where they intersect is the marketplace. Yes, and in pre-war Brody the houses gathered around this muddy, cobbled rectangle where the roads cross. At the far end of the north-south street is the railway station. This is correct too, and the trains recede to vanishing points in the east and west, towards Kiev and Lviv. On the streets are millers, labourers, broad-backed water-carriers, and, in roles just as menial, but imbued with a purpose beyond their meagre remuneration, what Roth terms members of a religious proletariat, the Torah scribes, ritual butchers, and makers of prayer shawls and candles. This could well be Brody, and previous books on Roth have asserted that it is, but it could be anywhere in Galicia. There are no defining details. The shtetl he conjures has a dreamlike quality, existing in a succession of intense moments loosely strung together, telling exchanges between unnamed characters that are over before we know it, playing out in tangential locations. Is it Brody? In the words of Helen Chambers, a Roth scholar and emeritus professor of German literature at St. Andrews University, I don't even know how much sense it makes to ask that. I think that's a very difficult question, because even when you read reportage, which is ostensibly factual, it's often fiction, and you have to remember that these people, Roth and fellow German-language authors cum journalists such as Theodor Fontana, are writers, so they'll construct what they think is a good narrative, and it'll draw on things that they actually knew. But you can't say, this is Brody and this is somewhere else. They'll transfer a church from one place to another place, and that goes on a lot more, I think, than people are aware of. Better to term it as Roth does, the little town. Yes, the shtetl is Brody, if it is anywhere, but it is everywhere and nowhere, and never was anywhere specific, apart from the place in Joseph Roth's mind where his memory met his imagination. In Roth's remembered Brody, there is a barracks to house blue-uniformed Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army troops, an imposing fortress synagogue dating from the 18th century, and a mansion on the outskirts owned by the Potocki family of Polish nobility. There is a narrow, crepuscular clockmaker's shop where an hourly cacophony erupts as if many cities' bell towers are all caught and imprisoned within its gloomy confines, and where he recalls desiring a pocket watch so he might measure the endless sea of time that stretches ahead in childhood, even though this notion prompts a shiver of curiosity and foreboding he only otherwise associates with the town's cemetery. There is a row of canvas-covered wooden stalls by a squat arcaded building that form the marketplace, or rynek. Pictures from the early 20th century show the market busy with shawled women, horse-drawn carts, cloth-capped boys, laden horses, bearded men in heavy coats, and down the road we see a church with a dome and cupola for the Orthodox Christian minority. In his 1974 German-language biography of Roth, the American scholar David Bronson noted of the market that more than 20 wholesalers and 200 retailers, nearly all of them Jewish, traded in corn, cattle, fur, wool from Russia, cotton, silk goods, scythes from Upper Austria, leather, jewels, pearls, brushes, and feathers. They scraped an existence in the poorest region of Austria-Hungary, whereas the other provinces experienced some economic uplift with the 19th century spread of capitalism. Galicia's industrial growth stood at 1/5 that of the rest of the empire. It formed a quarter of the empire's landmass and of its population. Of its 7 million inhabitants, in the year of Roth's birth, 3 million were illiterate. In 1890, 3/4 of Galicians worked in agriculture and less than 1/10 in industry. Most farmers grew potatoes and cereal, or bred livestock. The soil was rich and fertile. The lakes and rivers teemed with fish. But while the landowners flourished, little of the wealth trickled down to the workers. According to the enticingly titled 1888 text, Galician Misery in Numbers by Stanisław Szczepanowski, the average inhabitant of the province consumed only half as much food as the typical European and had 25% of the average European work capacity. Around 50,000 people died of starvation every year. Malnutrition led to lethargy, which led to low productivity, then to poverty. The poorest people of all were known as sea traders, those who were so desperate they'd sell anything they saw. The market was only the visible surface of the Brody economy. Lurking out of view were a multitude of smugglers who trafficked goods and people across the Russian border, laying blankets on the ground before them in winter so as not to leave footprints in the snow. Ukraina, the borderland, a place where it paid best to live unnoticed, where stealth, discretion, deceit, and transgression were woven into the fabric of daily life. The view from a Lviv-bound aeroplane descending over western Ukraine reveals the terrain that shaped these people's lives. It is the land that Joseph Roth describes in his finest novel, the Radetzky March, Radetzky March, one of great fertile levels scattered with small cruciform towns that abut vast forests, which from the plane window look like drapes of green crushed velvet, stroked and scuffed. The land's gentle contours are described by brown ribbon fields, dusted green with sprouting crops. It must be damp, for some fields segue via marshes into lakes. As you descend further, in the minute before the wheels judder on the runway, you might see solitary labourers hoeing or harvesting by hand, straight-legged and bent-backed. A tethered tan goat grazes a broad circle. A red-beaked white stork struts by the roadside. A farmer bumps down a rutted, gravelly track on his horse-drawn cart, just as Roth travelled upon, almost...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?